We're joined now on the phone by Professor Noam Chomsky, one of the country's top intellectuals. He's written dozens of books, hundreds of articles on the subjects of linguistics and international affairs. His latest books are Interventions, a collection of columns distributed by the New York Times Syndicate, and What We Say Goes, a collection of interviews. Professor Chomsky, welcome.
Glad to be with you.
You wrote in the October issue of Zing magazine that Washington has become excited about the possibility of Cold War II. Can you talk about any parallels, particularly regarding Iran-China relations at the current moment?
Well, Cold War II, as I wrote there, is mostly an image in the mind of Washington planners. The actual relationship to the similarity of the Cold War is pretty thin. And it's interesting that their image with regard to Iran is, in a way, the inverse of the Cold War doctrines. During the Cold War, we were supposed to be containing Russian, sometimes Chinese, aggression or potential aggression. In this Cold War, the way they're formulating it is we have to contain Iran's influence. No one claims, yes, some claim, but no one credibly claims that Iran is bent on aggression. In fact, it hasn't carried out any aggression for centuries. It's been the victim of aggression. But it is gaining influence. It's influential in Iraq. It's gaining influence in Afghanistan. The prime ministers of both countries are appealing to Iran for help. They're improving relations. There's concern that it's gaining influence in other parts of the region, Lebanon, Palestine, and so on. So we have to do something to contain Iran's influence. And the way they intend to contain Iran's influence is by the threat of violence. So that's not exactly the story of the first Cold War. With regard to Iran and China, well, yes, there's a close connection. China is lurking in the background as a major rising power, particularly in the East. China, for example, is the base for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is in fact developing as something that might turn out to be an alternative counterpart to NATO. It includes Russia, the Central Asian states. As observers, it includes India, Pakistan, and Iran. Includes Mongolia. It gives it now substantial clout as an energy system, as well as a potential force in world affairs. The United States requested observer status, but it was denied. However, again, Iran does have observer status, as does India, and they may join. It has called for U.S. forces to leave Central Asia, which the U.S. has been trying hard to penetrate. China is also making overtures to Saudi Arabia, and they're being reciprocated. Saudi Arabia is the oldest and most valued U.S. ally in the region because of its enormous energy reserves. With Iran being in many ways pushed into that orbit by U.S. hostility, it does begin to the system does begin to undermine U.S. domination of the region. And this is the region of the world's major energy resources. The U.S. has been committed to controlling it ever since Second World War, when it pretty much took over from the British as the world dominant power. The British had been committed to the same end since the First World War. There's a very definite connection between the U.S. attempts to contain Iran's influence and, if possible, to overthrow the regime, which has been a goal since 1979, there's a connection between that and the looming presence of China and the organized international system in which it plays a central role.
What do you think is the administration's agenda in promoting this type of rhetoric against Iran that they have been lately? I mean, presidential candidate Dennis Kucinich said we have to question George Bush's mental health when he makes a suggestion that you need to avoid World War III by preventing Iran from having the knowledge necessary to make a nuclear weapon. Is there a strategy that Bush has in mind?
I wouldn't want to talk about what Bush has in mind, but what's going on is a very extreme version of something that's been happening for a long time. And notice that of the viable Democratic candidates, I don't mean Dennis Kucinich or Mike Gravel, but of the others, every one of them has insisted on maintaining the threat of violence against Iran. That's what it means to say all options are on the table. The threat of violence alone is a severe violation of the United Nations Charter, which outlaws the threat or use of force. But that doesn't seem to bother anyone. And these policies go back to 1979. I mean, the United States here, we don't look at the history, but Iranians do. It means a lot to them and to the rest of the world. Just briefly, in 1953, the United States and Britain overthrew the last democratic government in Iran, parliamentary government, and installed the rule of a brutal tyrant, the Shah, who ruled with an iron hand, torture and repression, up until 1979 when he was overthrown. Since then, there was no concern about his human rights violations, which were horrible. In fact, the U.S. at the time, in the 1970s, was encouraging Iran to develop the nuclear programs that it is now pursuing. In fact, it's now pursuing them with the aid of some Iranian engineers who were trained in the United States in the 70s. That was Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Henry Kissinger were all urging Iran to develop nuclear enrichment programs, and were explaining why it was necessary. The same people who are saying the opposite today. The Iranians haven't forgotten that. When the Shah was overthrown, the U.S. turned at once to trying to restore the old arrangement with Iran as a client state, dependable client state. The U.S. supported Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq, strongly supported it. You may recall Donald Rumsfeld was sent there by Ronald Reagan to firm up deals to provide Iran with aid, including military aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction. The Iraq aggression cost hundreds of thousands of lives, many from chemical weapons, left Iran a wreck. And some of the leaders of Iran, like Ahmadinejad, for example, were fought in that war and remember it well, and recognize it to have been a U.S. war to supporting its friend Saddam Hussein to try to destroy Iran. Right after that came harsh sanctions that went through the Clinton years, and it's now escalating. So it has a history. The Bush administration happens to be extreme in this as in other respects, but it's the extreme end of a pretty narrow spectrum. And Iranians and others in the world don't forget that as easily as we choose to. The idea that there might be a World War III was not invented by George Bush. So a couple of months earlier, one of the leading British military historians, Correlli Barnett, warned in print that if the United States was crazy enough to attack Iran, it might very well lead to World War III. Actually, he said it certainly would, but at least a possibility. Not exactly Bush's point, but it is the position of almost the entire world. The United States' government is quite alone on this. Well, I think Israel's probably the only other country where there's any support at all for an attack on Iran. In the region, Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, other countries, the populations certainly do not like the Iranian government. They probably despise it, and they certainly don't want to have nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, they'd prefer for Iran to have nuclear weapons to having a U.S. war. That's been shown by U.S.-run polls. The U.S. government, even the American population, has been opposed. I'm not sure what the effect has been of the latest government media propaganda campaign. There haven't been very recent polls, but up until a couple of months ago, the population in the United States was overwhelmingly opposed to any threats against Iran, and in fact had pretty reasonable opinions about how to resolve the crisis.
I just wanted to say that even Israel last year during the Lebanon war, when the U.S. was making allusions to a continuation of that through Syria and to Iran, did pull back a bit on their rhetoric and didn't seem so willing to go after Iran.
Well, they would like the United States to go after Iran. They've wanted that for a long time. That's one of the reasons why they dragged their feet on the Iraq war. They didn't see much point in the United States attacking Iraq. But they went along with it after the United States had decided. But before that, they didn't like the idea because they for a long time wanted the U.S. to go after Iran, which is a curious thing because in the 1980s, Israel was had, I wouldn't say close relations, but it was developing relations with Iran. And the history of Israeli-Iranian relations is a complicated one. Actually goes back to biblical times, King Cyrus. A good study of this just came out by an Iranian-American scholar, Trita, Parsi. They do have shared interests, Israel and Iran. They have a shared interest in opposing the Arab world. They're both non-Arab states, of course, and they're in the middle of an Arab world. And those interests, so during the 80s, the United States, the United States was providing military aid to Saddam Hussein. Israel was providing some aid to Iran.
And, well, as you mentioned, the U.S. supports dictators when it's convenient and then demonizes them when it's not. On a more global sense, what do you think will be the result of that? I mean, is it sustainable? They have been doing it for the last 50 years. Will it be able to continue?
Yeah, more than 50 years, I'm afraid. It'll continue if the American population allows it. It's up to us. We're not powerless. I mean, it happens that the U.S. take Iran again. As I said, about 75% of the population have been opposed to any threats against Iran. Nevertheless, every viable candidate on both parties is intent on making those threats. Well, certainly within the power of the American population to impose their will on presidential candidates. We're not living in a totalitarian state. We're free.
Do you see
will, really?
Do you see that as happening within the electoral process or outside of it?
Well, right now, it's certainly not happening. The government media position is unchallenged within the public arena. It's only the general public that opposes it. And it's not just on this issue. I mean, the same is true of many other issues. I mean, take a domestic issue, say. The leading domestic issue for decades has been healthcare, either top in the poll or pretty close to it when people are asked about their primary concerns. And there's a good reason for that. The healthcare system is a complete disaster. It has about twice the per capita costs of other industrial countries and has some of the worst outcomes in the industrial world. So like infant mortality, for example, is about at the level of Malaysia, way below Europe. But in fact, U.S. statistics are comparable to Cuba, which is a poor third world country under U.S. attack and sanctions. So it's a scandal, and it really harms people. It's quite apart from the over 45 million uninsured. So sure, people care about it, and they have opinions about it. The large majority, for a long time, have been in favor of a system which would pretty much something like extending Medicare to the whole population, or one or another variant of that, which would save an enormous amount of money. Medicare, for example, is far more efficient than the private systems. It's a fraction of the administrative costs, and it could be made much more efficient. But that's that position, though it's the position that the large majority hold, does not enter into the political spectrum. When it's mentioned, even, it's called politically impossible.
Well, like you said, I mean, there are so many issues like this that the public has one opinion, but yet can't seem to force it through the system that's been set up. And to me, that brings up a bigger issue: is this system even workable to be democratic? Or just to put it more plainly, can capitalism and democracy coexist?
Well, I wouldn't call our system capitalism exactly. It's a kind of state capitalism which relies very heavily on the state sector for initiative and development of the economy. But whatever it is, yeah, they can coexist. I mean, it's a question. There are very powerful forces that act consciously to try to prevent people from entering the political arena to press their interests and concerns. So there are lots of ways in which people are atomized, separated from one another, deprived of information. Just take what we've just been discussing. There are very few people in the United States who could be aware that their position on Iran, the position of, say, 75% of the population, that their position is not isolated. Most people would think they're the only ones who think this. They've never read it. The polls don't get reported if they give the wrong results, and so on. So there's a lot to overcome, but it's not beyond our means. I mean, poor peasants in Bolivia should have taught us a lesson in democracy. Under facing far more harsh constraints than we do, in fact, terrible ones, they did manage to carry out a democratic election with real issues in which the majority of the population participated actively and elected their own candidate, poor peasant, on real issues. And they knew about the issues, and they did something about them.
Although that came in the midst of a popular rebellion, yeah. Do you think that's what it would take here?
Well, it was rebellion is maybe a strong word. There was no military rebellion. There's just demonstrations, actions to defend their rights, rejection of World Bank attempts to privatize the water system, which would have meant many people just can't get water to drink. So yeah, there were continued uprisings, popular uprisings on these issues, and it finally took the form of entering the political arena. We can do that. In fact, it's way easier for us. And it's been done plenty of times in the past and in U.S. history. I mean, take Medicare, which I mentioned. No, not the greatest thing in the world, but it's really a lifesaver for many people. It wasn't there 50 years ago. Where'd it come from? It wasn't, a gift from above. It was the result of substantial popular pressures. Same with the other benefits and privileges we've gained. Same with freedom of speech. Wasn't given by the founding fathers. Wasn't really in the 20th century, until the 20th century, that the Supreme Court really began to uphold it in a serious way. And one of the major victories for freedom of speech came in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, that's the way rights are won, not by just sitting around.
Although I don't suppose such a popular movement could be possible within the free speech zones. Could the civil rights movement happen today?
Why not? I think the ground is better prepared for it now than it was in the 1950s. Now, if you count the number of people who were really involved in one or another form of activism, I think it's greater now than it was in the 1960s, except maybe for a brief moment in the late 60s. And involved in all kinds of movements, and they've won a lot of victories. There's been a lot of progress since the 60s as a result of the activism of the 60s. I mean, take, say, women's rights. The situation is enormously improved from 40 years ago. even opposition to aggression. I mean, we complain, I complain, I'm sure you do, about the lack of protest against the Iraq War. But we forget, it's easy to forget, that at any similar stage of the Vietnam War, there was almost no opposition. It wasn't until there were hundreds of thousands of American troops occupying South Vietnam, and the country had been practically destroyed, and the war had extended to other countries. It wasn't until then that a substantial movement of protest developed. Well, it's not a great improvement, but it's some improvement since the 60s. Same in other dimensions. So sure, I think it's possible. It's going to take work, but it always has.
Do you think that the anti-globalization protests were what was responsible for the ending of the FTAA, and could something similar happen in regards to globalization in a more global sense?
Definitely. I don't like the term anti-globalization. It's a propaganda term. The people who meet in the World Social Forum, for example, are in favor of globalization. They want globalization in the interests of people, not in the interests of investors. So it's called anti-globalization. But putting aside the propaganda term, these are huge popular movements, completely unprecedented, never happened in history. They're international. They developed mostly in the South, but the North participates. And they've brought together people from all walks of life, professions, workers, peasants, others. And these are very powerful movements, mostly in the South, but here too. And that's something entirely new and extremely important.
All right. Thank you very much. I don't want to take any more of your time.
Okay.
But thank you for speaking with us about the topics of Iran and onward and upward to more subjects, hopefully, to bring this world to a better place.
Hope so. Good to talk to you.
Thank you very much.